You're the top salesman in your industry. You're crushing it. Your numbers are through the roof. But what makes you think that you can actually run a team? Why have they chosen you to be a leader? Just because you have top sales, does that mean that you should be a leader in your industry? And that's what we're here talking about today. We're talking about leadership, and I've got Mr. Brandon Williams here. Brandon, can you help answer that question? If you're a top salesman, why do people continue to think that they should be now in a leadership role?
Absolutely. Well, Darren, first of all, thanks for having me out here today. Just a great opportunity to be on your show, be on here. So really thank you for that. But that's a phenomenal question to start with, because we see that all the time, especially with sales teams. Because what typically happens, no matter what industry, business you're in, organization, you have a salesperson, right? Comes in for, entry level type thing. They do really great, busting their quotas, making their numbers. Hey, you're doing a good job. We're going to promote you this small sales team with about 2 or 3 people, right? Well, they go there, and what happens? Their team keeps up with them. Why? Because the person in charge of them is doing what? They're out there doing a great job. Then what happens? They get promoted to that next level. And that's where we typically see people stumble, because you go from a very small team, if any team,
Sure,
to a very large team where you're running, who knows, it could be a regional sales manager, it could be just a large part of that organization you're running now. And what do? You rely on the same thing. You rely on those technical skill sets, which you're right, you're a great salesperson, great at what you do, but here's the thing. You've never been taught what? Leadership skill sets.
Right.
Never had that experience. And it's not their fault. I mean, it's just that they haven't had that leadership development. They haven't had that true mentorship, or even if they had mentorship, they haven't had that leadership, because we confuse so many times, especially in the business world, we confuse that technical expertise or that managerial ability with leadership. And leadership, as we all know or should know, is a mindset. Just because you're good at what you do doesn't mean you're going to be a good leader. And that's where we see most people stumble. Right. Everybody's like, well, they're just not a good leader. Well, it's not really their fault. I mean, it's like throwing into anything and you've had no experience, no training. Right. What's going to happen,
Yeah.
Typically. Now, there's some people that fall into it and just have some luck and naturally gifted at a few things, but you're 100% right. That's just a great question to start with, because we see that all the time.
So, Brandon, why are you on the show today? Why are you the leadership expert? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure.
You've got an extensive career. You've led men, you've led women, you've keynote speaker. I think you've been a professor too, to some degree. Kind of fill us in a little bit about your resume and why you're the expert.
Well, yeah, thank you. So I was in the Air Force. Went to the United States Air Force Academy. Went into the Air Force pilot training. Was an F-15E fighter pilot, instructor pilot, evaluator pilot. Active duty for about 12 years. In that time, as you said, I served in numerous leadership roles, leading hundreds of people in several different organizations. Got out. When I was getting out of the Air Force of active duty, there's part of me that I was kind of divided. Part of me wanted to somehow continue flying. Part of me wanted to go into the business world. I wanted to go be a management consultant, get one of these big jobs and go and take some of this stuff and take it to the business world and see how I can do there. And so as I was going through this, I found a unique opportunity to get a job as a major airline pilot, which I still do as well. And then I kind of fell into the speaking business, if you will. The way I got into that, I got connected with an organization that was people similar to my background, fighter pilots, special operators, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, that type, who take what we learned in that world and take that to the business world and how we performed at a very high level. So I got into that world, thought I was going to do the consulting role. We had a speaking arm in that organization. Got into doing that, doing keynotes, found out I really, really enjoyed doing the speaking. And so that's how I got into it. I've given, like you said, over probably 300 keynotes, workshops, team building events, whatever you can call it, organizations all around the country now, all around the world actually. But in that time when we would do these events, what I found is, business leaders would come up to me inevitably after these keynotes and say, well, this is great, this process, but how do you really get people to, be accountable? How do you empower people? How do you get people to do what you want them to do, right? Basically basic leadership questions that I think I took for granted when I was a young officer in the Air Force and the military. Because I think back in some of those basic leadership lessons we were taught, whether it was at the Air Force Academy or as a young officer, we were just kind of taught and expected to do. So I took a lot of that. I took the world I operated in, flying those, 100 million high performance jet aircraft in so many different uncertain, dynamic, and complex environments, how we excelled in those environments. But you mentioned the adjunct professor thing. I've also been an adjunct professor in aviation safety and human factors. And human factors is really the study of how we as humans interact with our environments, right? So this desk, this equipment we're using, those laptops, cars we drive, everything that we use has human factors designed into it, how the human interacts with that piece of technology. And I always said, we think about that in engineering, but we don't ever talk about human factors when we talk about how we design our teams. And so the idea, what I took was that experience of operating in that world, being a fighter pilot, officer in the Air Force, but also the science behind it. Why the things we did worked and allowed us to perform at a very high level. And it goes back to leadership. What leaders have to understand about human factors. What I mean by that is when we show up to work, we all have those human factors going on, whether it's mental fatigue, physical fatigue, complacency, lack of awareness, lack of communication. All of these things are what essentially drive human error, which is when we get bad decisions, bad actions. And so any leader, what is the number one goal of any leader? Is drive performance. I mean, that's it. At the end of the day, you can talk about ways to do it, but it's to drive better performance, period, dot. And so leaders have to understand those human factors. And so that's where I can develop this methodology I use, human factors leadership. And like you said, we deliver keynotes, workshops, do leadership coaching, again, all based on my time in the Air Force as a fighter pilot, how we led in those very uncertain, complex environments, but also the science behind it, as you said. So I've been doing that, adjunct teaching still at several universities around the country, major airline pilot, but that's what I do.
When do you have time for family?
So that's a good question. So we talk about this a lot. I hear a lot about balance, right?
Sure.
And balance is a great way to think about it. But I think a better term, and I can't take credit for this, I read this on LinkedIn, I forgot who it was, but they talked more about coexistence or integration with work and personal life. So what do I mean by that? I think you said something, I think I saw you put something out about right before Christmas break, you're like, we're all going to get some time off.
Yep.
You want to unplug, but when you unplug, does that mean you just go sit for a week and never make yourself better at anything? Absolutely not, right? It should be something you want to do.
Sure.
So, when I'm home, the great thing about my job as an airline pilot and my business is when I'm home, I'm home. Now, if I'm not out developing my business, I'm not going to do much there.
Right.
But it is a coexistence of how I integrate that, I think, in with my personal life, my family life, staying involved in my kids' activities, whether it's coaching, going to their events. We see each other all the time around town, and bringing them in on that, bringing them in on the things I do. I just took my son on a trip that I went on with my airline. So he went with me, flew with me, things like that. So I think it's critically important you find, yes, that balance. I love that. But also that coexistence or integration.
Yeah, I mean, that's important for the fatigue part of it too, right? You mentioned whether it's mental or physical fatigue. If you're not coming in, you're not refreshed, you're not energized, you're not going to be the leader that you need to be or want to be. Right.
So I think with that, you got to find a outlet as well. Something you can do and focus on to get better at that's outside of professional work.
Sure.
Whether that be, golf, whether that be working out, whether that be hobby activities, something like that. I think that's important as well with that.
So I've had this conversation with a lot of people just in general, not necessarily about leadership, but about hobbies, right? So hobbies or things that you enjoy to do, whether they're hobbies or not, there can be too many hobbies too, right? Because if you get to a point where you're doing too many things, you're spreading yourself too thin. Is that accurate to think that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what do they say? Jack of all trades, master of nothing, right? Kind of that mentality. But I think you can definitely get to that point because this leads right into my methodology. Actually, is one of the key things I talk about is what I call a clear intent, which really comes down to a narrow focus. And so where this comes into my leadership development is leaders have to narrow that focus for their people. What do I mean by that? Well, inevitably when I talk to these business leaders, whatever organization, I'll ask them, what's your intent for this year, this quarter? And inevitably they'll start listing off, 10, 15 things. I said, this is great. That's strategic initiatives. But what are the top 3 narrow focus priorities you want your people to think about?
Do they,
as a backdrop?
When they give you that list, is it more performance driven, like sales, numbers, things of that nature?
Many times it is. I mean, a lot of time, and it should. You should have some metrics in those strategic initiatives. Sometimes it's just, we want to do this, and that's a different conversation because that's a conversation of clearly defined outcomes, I call it. How do you define those? But when it comes down to the clear intent, that is the, hey, what are the top 3 priorities here that you want them to focus on? It's not a strategy. And I think it's a little more detailed than a vision because it really narrows down to what are the top 3 things you want them to focus on. Or what are when they make decisions, you want to empower them with autonomy, right? But what do you have to have with autonomy? You got to have some kind of alignment, right? Because then we're just all going all over the place.
Right.
So when they make those decisions, plan their tactical objectives, as we call it, for that day, that month, that week, that year, what's the kind of backdrop you want them to think about? Hey, with your team, Darren, like when they're out doing their stuff and they're making decisions and you want them to, I know, what are the top 3 things, kind of your narrow focus you want them to think about when they're trying to make decisions? That's where it comes down to clear intent. But it goes back to that focus thing, that why that is so important, again, human factors. Because what do we as humans do really well? When we focus on the task at hand, right? Mm-hmm. So when I was flying that F-15E, right, there were 250 switches, dials, and displays in that cockpit. Human mind could never possibly take in all that info at once, right? Multitasking is a myth. We've proven that. But what did we do? My instructors, my leadership, my flight leads over the years have taught me, hey, when I'm in certain situations, this is what you want to focus on, these 2 or 3 instruments, and you disregard everything else because that's what's most important. Because we humans, when we think about everything we have to do this week, this month, this year, what do? We get frustrated.
Too much.
We just don't live there. So that focus that you talked about is critical. You've got to narrow down. And sometimes, what is that? That's the power of no. We talk, you hear people talk about that, but it's true. If it doesn't align to your intent, then you have to say no sometimes.
Right. Now, I've heard you use the word taught. You were educated. The military, sounds like, or at least in the Air Force, and then as in your training, they taught you how to be a leader. Mm-hmm. So I asked this question when I saw you speak at the Woodstock Business Club a while back. Are leaders born or are they taught? And it sounds like you're indicating that they're taught and not necessarily born.
That's again just a phenomenal question, because I think everybody is born with obviously certain skill sets, certain attributes, certain characteristics. Some of us are good communicators. Some of us are good, analytics. We can look at a problem and just have a knack for pulling out stuff. Some of us are good at numbers. Some of us are good at organization. We all have different attributes that can contribute to making a leader, but none of us are born with everything that makes a good leader. I mean, nobody is. So I think leadership that's why I say it's a mindset, because it's all about how do we continuously make that better? Mm-hmm. Again, just because you like golf, I use that example. Think about a golf swing. It seems so easy, right? Hitting a little ball with a metal stick,
it's not
right?
even moving.
But right, not a moving target. So easy, right there. But there are so many things, especially when you start out, that you have to think about. So many things that have to go right, like 100 miracles have to go right, have that perfect shot. And so I equate that back to leadership, that there are so many things that a leader has to consider and develop to be that good leader. Is anybody ever going to be a perfect leader? No, right? And it's like with my leadership business, my methodology, I always say, hey, you don't have to take everything I tell you. But if you can just take 1 or 2 things to kind of incorporate, there's thousands and thousands of leadership books right out there. None of them are the pure answer. Some are better than others. But I think from most of them, you can take bits and pieces to kind of formulate that toolbox for your leadership. So no, I don't think leaders are born. I think we're born with certain attributes, but I think that's something that must be continually, and you never stop doing it.
So continuous education is key. Now, what are some of the things that you would, for somebody like the example that I said in the beginning when we opened up, that was literally me, right? I came out of college, and I did play college athletics, so I had some team understanding, understood how to sort of captain a team, if you will.
Right.
But I was never given any sort of literally leadership type training. I got into the industry, had some immediate success, and the next thing you know, I had a team of 10. They literally put me on a team of 10. And the type of person I am, of course, this was back in the early 2000s, and information wasn't as easily accessible.
Yeah.
It was there, but it was a little more challenging to find than it is today, right? So, I was digging in and trying to educate myself a little bit, but certainly made plenty of mistakes, still make plenty of mistakes.
Yeah.
What would you advise somebody right now, or maybe the top 3 things that someone can focus on in the very beginning stages of their sort of leadership path?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest thing, especially any leader, especially new leaders, or the biggest. I'll just start out with the biggest error I see is kind of what you were talking about, and you probably saw this, but it's This idea that as the leader, I have to make all the right decisions and I can never be wrong, right? Because it's natural human instinct to think that, again, human factors, because we want to, hey, I'm leading these people. I can't look weak, or I can't look like I don't know what I'm doing in front of them. When, yes, you want to have confidence as a leader, but nothing will make your people, from what I found, want to follow you more. Nothing will make them want to do the 110% for you as a person that can show transparency and a leader that can show, hey, I don't have all the answers, or take their inputs, because that's showing transparency. It's showing accountability, which that's the other thing, is accountability. You know, we've worked for leaders that didn't have accountability, so could not admit when they made a bad decision or a wrong decision, or worse, even worse, work for leaders that blame bad decisions on someone on their team or, you know, actions on their team. And so when your people see you do that, when they see you have that transparency, when they see you take that accountability, that whether it's, hey, I made the wrong decision here, or, hey, I don't have all the answers, what do you got? When they see that, what does that do? Well, it empowers them to speak up, right? It empowers them to say something. But also, what do you want for people on your team? You want them to be accountable. You want to have accountability. And I always say this all the time. The number one way for leaders to do that is you have to be accountable yourselves. You have to be accountable to when you don't make the right decision, like I said, or when you don't have all the answers. And so I think that is if I could just give one thing to new leaders, it would be that. Because don't worry, people don't expect you to have all the answers. As a matter of fact, they're going to respect you more when you can speak up and say that, you know, you don't have all the answers.
Right.
You asked for 3, so I'll give you one more. But I think with decision making, I talk about this a lot. You know, oftentimes it's better, you know, if you have the 80% solution to move forward, assuming you've taken your time to develop that situation awareness, because nothing's worse than someone that just can't make a decision, right? So many times it's better to move forward and make that decision. If it was the wrong decision, you learn from it, as long as you're not always making wrong decisions, right?
Right. So you feel the probability of the probability is high, as a high likelihood that you've made the right decision.
That's any decision, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's any
absolutely.
decision we do in life.
There's no guarantees. There's no definites, right? So you got to make a decision based on probability.
Analysis paralysis happens to young leaders all the time. And you got to understand, when you have that 80% solution, many times it's good to move on. That's where your people come in too. Hey, take their inputs. What do you think? You're good? Okay, let's go.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about the difference between motivation or motivating your team versus inspiring your team.
Oh man, that's a good question. I think inspiration comes from your team seeing examples of success, right? Comes from your teams seeing an example of someone who did something that you're trying to get them to do, or some, you know, great action. You know, inspiration comes from, that's where, when you highlight people in your team, say someone does a great job. Right. Well, not only are you helping them by, you know, showing their accolades in front of the rest of the team, but I think you're inspiring other teammates to, hey, this, you know, we can do that. So I think that's an inspiration. Motivation comes from what really motivates people, right? That's human factors. That's, hey, what really drives people? I mean, is there financial motivation? Sure, there is. But what's even more powerful than that? It's that intrinsic motivation. Because deep down in human factors, since the days of, you know, building fires in caves and trying to run away from saber-toothed tigers and all that kind of stuff, right? What has motivated us? It's to be part of a community, right? To be survive, obviously, but after that's met, be part of a community, be needed, right? Be heard. And so that goes back to empowerment. So I think the number one way to motivate your people is through empowerment. That goes through, you know, you talk about autonomy, you talk about how you empower them to do certain things. But again, that empowerment, autonomy, you have to have that pure accountability. You've got to have that alignment. So, right. But I think that comes from that empowerment, from the motivation.
What do you think about leading by example? Like, is it more important to lead by example or to lead with your words, or lead by sort of direction? In other words, I'm trying to think, like, back in my own personal situation, right? You know, these are the things that I've done. These are the things that I continue to do. I continue to show up. I continue to be part of the community. I go to the networking groups. I'm trying to lead by example, as opposed to not necessarily, hey, you need to do this. You need to do that. Right. Is there a combination, or is it, you know, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, it's definitely a combination because as a leader, you've got to be able, as I said, clear intent earlier, right? You've got to be able to be a person that can take that, your strategic vision and narrow that down for your people. Narrow that focus, as I say, drive that clear intent. So that's what makes many leaders good at what they do. They're able to take that and take their vision and drive it down to a focus. So that is a critical skill set for a leader. But talk is cheap, right? So like you said, I think that lead by example is definitely more important. I think that is people want to see you as a leader, not only talk the talk, but walk the walk, right? I mean, if you were a, salesperson, right? Or you're leading a sales team, what kind of a leader are you going to be if you've never had any experience doing that, right?
Sure.
So, or you can't go out and you've asked your people to do something, but you can't go do it. Or you're not out there in the field. You're not in the front lines doing that. I mean, from the military, that's a time-honored tradition of what made the best leaders were those leaders that led by example. And nothing's more motivating. You talk about inspiring, nothing's more inspiring than seeing a leader that not only has that leadership ability, but also has that skill set. Going back to the Air Force, we used to always say squadron commanders, you had typically two types of squadron commanders a lot of times. One that was the really good people person, just got along with everybody, walk in a room and people. And then you had the other one who was the tactical, very tactical minded, highly skill set fighter pilot, really probably the best stick in the squadron, things like that. When you had the one that was both of those, that was the best leaders because they had the people skill set, but they also had the tactical prowess to, be able to relay that tactical skill sets, and people respected them for that. So I think that's a great example that it is important for both, but I think if you had to pick one, it's that lead by example because people want to see you as a leader out there doing it, right?
Sure, agreed.
It's hard to follow someone that doesn't.
Now, here you talk on some of the different videos, and we'll post a couple different videos that you've done and some of the interviews and keynotes that you've done in the description below. Do you talk a lot about debriefing? After either a positive or a negative sale or transaction or whatever the case may be, coming together and then debriefing, evaluating what went wrong, what went right.
Right.
Talk about what that is and how important that is. From not only a leadership standpoint, but also for your team.
Man, just phenomenal, Darren. I'm so glad you brought that up because we're talking about leaders and what they can take, right? And if I had to find one tool that they could put in their toolbox for their team or themselves, it would be the debrief. Now, we talk about debriefing. There's a lot of ideas out there, right? There's postmortems, after actions, name your other, root cause analysis, things we talk about that we want to evaluate our performance. But I think the key with what we call the fighter pilot debrief, and was something we hold near and dear, because after every mission we did, whether it was a training mission, training sortie, combat, we always came back, went in a room, shut the door, rank came off. Didn't matter what your rank was, what your title was, what your role was, because we walked in that room, all we were doing was going to dissect our performance so that we can develop lessons learned to perform better. And that debrief, that's all it's about. It's not an evaluation of individual performance. It's not a time for leaders to come in and set in and kind of evaluate their people and see how it went. All it is to drive performance, to evaluate performance and ultimately develop lessons learned.
So real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to know, how do you take that hat off? As, we're in a team here, there's 6 of us, okay, there's if I'm in there, we're talking about a negative event or a positive event, how do you remove sort of that leadership, that managerial, that CEO type of hat to be able to talk with the individual that you're debriefing?
There's a few things there. First of all, obviously the fighter pilot, from day one of Air Force pilot training as a young student. We start that integration right away, right? We come back, hey, we're going to debrief this sortie. So with us, it was a culture, it was a way we did business. And I think that's how organizations can also, integrate that and take that and you get around some of that stuff you're talking about. Because the more we do something, the better we get at it, right?
Sure.
So the more we do it, it's consistency. That's one thing. But even more important, I talked a lot earlier about transparency about leaders. So Darren, let's say you get your team members together, y'all go in a room and you're going to debrief, say, a certain task or event or a project. Well, the first thing you do, Darren, as a leader of the organization, what you should do is right away open up, set that tone of accountability, I call it, with some things you could have done better as a leader. What's some things you could have done better for the team? Hey, here's some things I want to identify that I either made maybe a misstep on, or maybe a slightly questionable decision, or didn't set you up for. Then you go around the room and you say, what do you have for me? What do you have for me? And all you're doing there, Darren, you're just taking down those barriers to communication. And so what does that do for the rest of the people on your team? They say, hey, look, if the person that essentially, hires and fires and knows everything about me, or kind of runs my career, my job here, if they can admit their mistakes and shortcomings in front of all of us, then I surely can. And that's how we did it. I mean, that's how we would, I'd walk in a room, and I've been in debriefs when I was, a young captain, very few years younger than I am now. And I'm flying with, colonels or even generals sometimes in my formation. I mean, people that outrank me by years. Not only did they welcome, but they expected us to point out their missteps that day, because they knew that was the only way their team was going to get better. And they knew that was going to eventually potentially save lives one day. So you've got to, as a leader, again, set that tone of accountability by first displaying yourself. And I think that's the most powerful way to do that. But then it goes back to as well as consistency, how you debrief, when you debrief,
right,
and just making that a way of, of how you do business, essentially.
All right, so as I was preparing for this, listened to several keynote speakers out there, and they talk a lot about empathy. The ability to listen and to help and try to understand or put yourself in their same shoes as that individual who you
Right.
work with on a daily basis. How important is that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, empathy is, critical, because when I talked about earlier, I said, accountability within an organization. Well, one of the key things I talk about in my methodology is something called mutual support, which was the idea, something I brought again from the fighter pilot world. But if you ever see two fighter jets take off, it's like I said, it's two. It's never one, right? Mm-hmm. We're always going out with another wingman, mutual support. Whether it's training, combat, always going out with mutual support, because we learned long time ago in combat aviation that when you're going out alone and unafraid in these uncertain, complex environments, it's critical that you have that mutual support. But why did that mutual support work? Well, in the fighter squadrons I was a part of, that camaraderie, that high level of just close-knit, the people you work together, you play together, right? You know about each other. It's not just we show up and we're colleagues. I know a lot about you. I probably know your family. We've hung out together. We do events together. So not only, Darren, are you just out there doing that because it's your job. Like, I'm not just going to help you because it's my job. I'm going to get fired. It's because I don't want you to look bad. I know you. You're my friend. We work together, and you're part of my squadron. I know one day our lives may depend on each other. So I want you to look good. I want you to, if you're in charge of a project and I'm helping you with it, I want to make sure I don't drop the ball, because I don't want to be that person. But what does that go back to? Again, that human factors, right, of wanting to be part of that team. And that's where empathy comes in, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we drive that? Well, that comes from empathy. That shows, as a leader, number one, you drive that by showing that care or concern for your people. Because I said earlier that the number one goal of any leader is, bottom line, is to drive better performance. At the end of the day, that's it. But one of the best tools to do that, if you want your people to show care or concern for what they do for their teammates, you've got to do that for a leader. And how do you do that for empathy, right? And it's just little things. I mean, how's your day going? Just learning little bits and pieces about people, right? Mm-hmm. And how do you do that as a leader, whether you're especially a small business? Very easy for you, right, to have after work get-togethers on Fridays, or just, nobody likes mandatory fun, but sure, little things that you can do to drive that camaraderie in an organization. And then that's how you get that empathy. And as a leader, if you want your people to do that, you got to show that as well. Mm-hmm. So showing care, concern for those people and how they're doing, how you can help them.
What about collaboration? Now, should you be collaborating with, sort of an obvious question. I mean, of course you should be collaborating with the folks that you work with
Sure.
on a regular basis.
Sure.
But, how important is that in your leadership style or your success as a leader?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, I talked earlier about the debrief, saying, hey, a debrief is not the time for, leaders of organization, if you were not part of that event, to come in and say, hey, I want to evaluate you guys, see how you did, right? But and that goes back to, for a debrief, who should be in a debrief? And I always say it's only the people that were part of that team. That's it. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter what your rank is, what your title is, what your role is. If you weren't part of that execution, you shouldn't be in that debrief, because you don't need to see how the sausage is made. You just need to get the lessons learned. And there's probably things you want to take to leaders after that. Say, hey, we found this after we debriefed, right? So I think that's piece. So I think it depends, right? Because if you're a leader and you're constantly wanting to collaborate or being involved in everything, are you really giving autonomy? Are you really giving empowerment? Probably not. So I think that's up to you as a leader to determine where you come in at. Now, you should definitely always have that, hey, come to me if I can help you. Come to me if I can provide a resource, if I can do something for this. But that doesn't mean you have to be involved and engaged. And I don't think any leader would want that. I mean, if everybody came to you with every single decision, you'd never get anything done, right?
No.
So I think that depends.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, throughout the conversation, I've heard you use the word complex a few times. What do you mean by complex?
Sure.
And then I also heard you mention something earlier, on a different keynote or discussion where you were describing between complex and complicated.
Right.
Can you explain to us what that means?
Yeah, and I think people oftentimes interchange these, but complicated implies something that is, difficult to understand, hard to learn, hard to grasp. For example, these cell phones we have in our pocket, right? Complex or complicated? I'd say complicated. I mean, you and I probably couldn't sit here and build an iPhone, right?
No, sir.
But with enough money, enough time, enough smart people that know how to do that and skilled people, we could, right? I mean, there are millions and millions on the bill, right? So complicated, hard to understand. However, how that iPhone interacts with our lives has changed the world, has, whether it's from an economic, financial standpoint, social standpoint, you name it, how it interacts and enters our world, that is complex. And complexity defines it's a systems-based way of thinking. And that system can be anything. It could be your team. It could be your business, your industry, the world economy as a whole, the country, you name it. But a complex system implies something that has so many different variables affecting it, interdependent variables, that one change can change that system, and it's going to change those variables in a way the human mind can't possibly understand. That F-15E I flew, again, complicated, right? I couldn't build an F-15E.
Certainly.
But we built hundreds and hundreds of them. So given enough time, tools, resources, we can definitely do that. It's designed to work a certain way, very predictable, right? But you take that F-15E and throw it into an environment, ever-changing conditions, weather, terrain, combat environments anymore. You're trying to manage other assets out there. You're going out with a 100-jet mission package, right, that you're trying to orchestrate and build that 3D picture in your mind. That's complex, right? So leaders have to understand, because we all operate in a complex world. We do. No matter what you do, no matter what level you're at, we're all operating in a complex world. The problem is the human mind, again, it hasn't changed much since, caveman days. And we don't like complexity, right? We like simple, we like habit. So leaders have to understand how you help your people execute, lead, and perform at a very high level in that complexity and uncertainty.
That's a lot, for sure. I'm just trying to relate it back to the world of mortgages, and we're certainly in a complex environment right now.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've been in. It's always a complex. I mean, we were talking about a macro scale. No matter if what the Fed says, what the Fed does, what consumer price index looks like, what personal consumption expenditures look like. All these different factors go into how mortgage rates are
just
determined.
By the nature that you can't predict that. No. Since it's complex, right?
It's very challenging to predict, for sure. There's a lot of smarter people than me that are doing that, and a much better job as far as determining where rates are going and so on and so forth. So, Brandon, thank you. That was amazing.
This is great.
Can you tell us, before we go, I want to know, do you know off the top of your head how many hours you actually flew in the F-15?
Let's see. Total Air Force hours, I had about 3,000. And so F-15E hours would have been probably roughly half of that, about 1,500.
How when you're in an F-15, what's the time frame that you're up in the air?
So typically, most missions, and this is fairly similar to most fighters, our missions would be training at least, would be typically, depending on what you were doing. If you're in an air-to-air mission where you're burning a lot of gas because you're a lot of throttle movement, airplanes burn a lot more gas, maybe an hour. Air-to-ground mission, doing a little more close air support type stuff. It's an hour and a half, sometimes 2-hour missions, depending on how much fuel you carried and things like that. Combat missions when we were deployed, part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, and we were doing 6, 7, 8. I mean, there's missions that went 12 hours or more.
Wow.
Which is a lot of time in a very small, confined space.
That's unbelievable.
But I think...
And so you were refueling, obviously, during...
Oh, yeah. You would do, I mean, typically 3 to 4 air refueling tankings, which in itself is a fairly... tasking.
That seems like a complex environment.
It is. 2 airplanes, very high speed, flying close to a lot of fuel. Yeah, not a good combination. But I think with that, it's important to understand. So you have that 1.5 hour mission. Let's say call it a training mission. Well, what you don't see is we stepped out to the jet about an hour prior to takeoff. So that's 1 hour. We then briefed for at least an hour, which a briefing is another important thing I talk about in my leadership methodology.
And that's prior to getting in the plane.
Absolutely. That's essentially developing that shared mental model, doing that visual walkthrough. You know, it's a lot of times what professional athletes do, you know, visualizing that mission. And then even prior to that, we're showing up 3 to 4 hours prior to that just for mission planning. So that's 4, 5, 6 hours before you even take off. Mm-hmm. Fly, come back, and we debrief. Mm-hmm. The debrief typically starts an hour after landing. So now you're up to close to 8 hours. Haven't even debriefed yet. Mm-hmm. And now the debriefs can range anywhere from an hour to way longer than that.
Wow.
So then you have your normal, you know, we have a normal office administrator job to run these organizations, whether it's, you know, scheduling or director of operations and handling all that people stuff you still got to do. So.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the obvious answer would be when I ask what's the most fun about being a pilot. I would imagine it's the flying portion of it, but you're so analytical and your approach is so different. Did you enjoy that portion of it, the briefing, the planning, everything leading up to get into the plane?
I think what I enjoyed about it was the extreme challenge of it. Mm-hmm. I think that I don't think I've ever done anything in terms of human performance that's been that challenging. Challenging to be very good at it, if that makes sense. So we were always constantly trying to get better, always constantly trying to, you know, drive that perfection. You know, nobody's perfect. But I think what that did for me, though, is with my business and things like that, I carried that same mentality over. Mm-hmm. Now, I've had to rein that in a little bit because when you understand that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily operate at that level and have a little more understanding of people and empathy when you work with other teams and organizations. But I think that's one of the best, you know, things we take to organizations is some of that, you know, whether it's that accountability or the idea of that, you know, very high precision drive in it. So yes, it was fun, but I think it was the challenging part of it that also makes it, you know, fun. It was something that was never, ever easy, no matter what you did.
So the challenges that you face today is about building your business and being able to communicate with the folks and understanding that they don't necessarily have that same drive as you. Is that tough from your point of view?
Yeah. I mean, and not even from a professional standpoint, even a personal standpoint.
Right.
I mean, whether it's, you know, out in the community or working with contractors or your house or doing something there, here or there, just understanding that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily operate at that level, which is fine. But I think that with the business, the biggest challenge was, I mean, you know, coming out of the military, I mean, I'd never ran a business, anything like that. Now, I learned a lot. Over the years, I've learned a lot. I got a master's in management, other stuff. But, you know, applying that, and I think the biggest thing for me was, because I learned the power of mutual support as a fighter pilot. Mm-hmm. But I had to also, as a fighter pilot, as painful as it was me to say I'm not good at everything. Mm-hmm. So how you lean on, you know, other people to help you in certain areas. But also, as you know, I mean, where to find people to help you with that. I'm not talking about just employees. I'm talking, you know, whether it's vendors, whether it's partners, whether it's people to help you with this and marketing or this or that. I mean, we've talked about some of that stuff before, but it was just where to find all that. And also, where do you put your resources, whether it's your time or your financial resources? What's the biggest bang for your buck? What's your centers of gravity? I mean, things like that is the biggest struggle for me, I think.
Yeah. Brandon, you talked about your business, but you don't think you've mentioned your business. What's the name of your business?
Yeah, so Brandon Williams, the fighter pilot speaker. It's also Lead TAC is the name of the company, Lead TAC Leadership Development. But we work with teams to build high-performing, high-reliability organizations. And so how we develop leaders, and that's, again, based on my time as a fighter pilot and also based on human factor science, some of the things we talk about. It works. I mean, I know they always say you got to narrow down a niche, and you do, but I just can't stand that because it works no matter what you do.
Yeah.
This stuff is critical for everyone. It doesn't matter what level you're at either. Entry level, frontline employees, middle management, C-suite executive, because all these things are important. We work with a lot of sales teams because they're always trying to drive better performance.
Sure.
Several different industries. I seem to be working a lot with healthcare and pharmaceutical lately. I think a lot of that is based on the worlds they operate in. Pharmaceutical mainly with sales teams. Work a lot with tech and financial type background companies. But really it does apply to so many different teams. So that's what I do. We do keynotes, workshops, and leadership coaching. So.
And we'll put all the descriptions, all the links in the bottom, LinkedIn, the websites, so on and so forth, to make certain that anybody who's watching wants to get in touch with Brandon here. We'll certainly be able to do that for you. What can you leave us with before we sign off here? One last thing.
One thing. Well, I think I'll go back to, as leaders, because you talked about this earlier, I think this is critically important. Think about who's watching this and who's seeing this. If it's that person that's in that leadership role, maybe for the first time, maybe trying to drive that, that better performance organization, how do they become a better leader? But I want to go back to that open, honest, transparency, accountability. I think if you want to drive that accountability within your teams, within your organizations, drive that autonomy, you as a leader first have to take a look at yourself. A little bit of self-debrief. Hey, am I as accountable as I can be? Am I as transparent as I can be? Am I open and honest with my people? Because that's how you want them to be, right? So if for all the leaders out there or anybody watching, no matter what, here's the thing, no matter what you do, you may say, I'm not a leader, but everyone's a leader in some sense. No matter what role you're in. Leadership's not a role or a title, right? It's a mindset, like I said. So do that self-debrief. See where you can be a little more accountable, a little more open, honest with your people, a little more transparent. I think that's going to drive better results for you. You can find better ways to do that for sure.
What's your favorite movie?
Top Gun, of course.
I was hoping you'd say that. Brandon, thank you, brother.
All
Appreciate
right.
you, man.
Jared, thanks a lot.
That was another, you'll love this, guaranteed interview. We'll see you on the next one.
See you.